Welcome to another installment of the Omnis Studio Web Development Basics video training series. Today, I will show you how to temporarily save and display entered data in lists. Hope you have fun. So far, we've only talked about how a user can enter data into our app, but we did not really speak about how we can display the data. And that's where lists and the appropriate components such as the DataGrid come into play. And in today's video, we will look directly in Omnis Studio to see how this works exactly. I don't think I'll need to say it again, but never mind. We're back here in our familiar library. And our aim is now to temporarily store data that our users enter in a list. First of all, we have to define a list. And since a list is nothing else than a variable, we proceed in the same way as we did for creating a variable. So we go to our class, or I create a new one, a remote form, JS contacts. The name may already give you an idea what I intend to do with it. That is, I want to save and display contacts here later. But one thing at a time. Let's go to the methods and create a new instance variable up here. A quick note, it doesn't have to be an instance variable in order to become a list, but it must be an instance variable in order to display it in the remote form. We already discussed this in a prior video. Well, I call it iContactList, and the type is then logically list. So far so good. But now we come to the exciting part. Somehow, we still have to define which columns the list should have, and also what kind of columns they are, and which data types the respective columns have. Maybe here in the subtype, but it's empty. However, that's not a bad attempt, because we can now create a schema in which the columns are defined, and then specify it here. And a schema is nothing else than a class, so I simply go back to the Studio browser. By the way, this can be done very quickly with F2, and create a new schema here via New Class and then Schema. It's recommendable to always name this like the future list, in my case Contact List or SC Contact List, because here is again a naming convention. In particular, that the names of schema classes should always start with SC, i.e. SC Contact List, top. By double-clicking on the schema, we get to this window and can now define the columns. And since I want to save the names and surnames of my contacts, I need one column each, one for the first name and one for the surname. As the table here also works in the same way as the table in the method editor where you can create the variables, I think I don't need to say much more about it, so just put it here. I call the first column first name, and it gets the data type character. And I call the second column last name accordingly, and it also gets the type character. That's it. Done. Columns defined. Now we just connect our list variable, iContactList, with the schema, here in the subtype. Exactly. We now find our schema SCContactList and simply select it. And now the list is ready for use. This means we can now write data to our list. And to make sure that the user can do this, I'll go back to the design editor with the shortcut F3. And add two input fields here. One for the first name and a second for the surname. I'll call this one entry first name and set the label here to first name. And I call this entry last name and set a label here too. Yes, here, last name. Perhaps some of you already noticed, I have not yet assigned a data name to the input fields. In other words, I haven't linked any variables to them. This is because I don't want to create a separate variable for each input field this time, especially as these would also have the same definition as the columns in the list, so I would therefore have to do the work twice. Instead, I simply use a row variable for this, which is more or less defined like a list, but only has one row. Let's go back to the method editor. I call the variable iContactEntryRow of type row, and here we can now select a schema for the definition as we did with the list. Great. Now we just link the input fields to the correct column. So here, iContactEntryRow, and then simply a dot to select the column. And since we're using a schema, the Code Assistant helps us here with the available columns, and now I simply select first name. And here, also, iContactEntryRow dot last name. The next item we need is a button so that the user can save the contact. So let's add another button here. I'll call it Button Add Contact, and in the text field, I'll type Add Contact. Then I drag a list component directly into here, in fact the DataGrid. And while we're at it, I'll rename it to Grid Contacts, and now enter our list variable, iContactList, here in the data name. To make sure two columns are also displayed, we set two columns under Appearance in Design Calls. I also set here that the column width is specified in %, so I set the property column widths are percentage to ktrue, and so that both columns are not 150% large, I set the columns here under column widths to 50 and 50% respectively. Perfect. If we now test our work and enter something here, Paul and Ford, we can already guess what happens when we press Add Contact. Exactly, nothing. We haven't added a function to the button yet, but we'll do that now. So I'll go straight to the code behind the button because we want something to happen here. We want to enter the content, iContactEntryRow, in a new line in our iContact list. And that's surprisingly easy. We first address our list, then add a new row with the $add method, and write our row variable into it with $assignRow. So, do iContactList.$add. We would now add an empty row, but if we want to fill it with a row variable right away, we can add another method directly after the $add, namely $assignRow, and in the brackets we simply enter our row variable. Normally, you would have to reference a row in the list to use the $assignRow method, but since the $add method directly returns a reference to the newly added column, it works. That's it already. Let's test it now. Wonderful. One thing still bothers me, though. I think that if you have added a contact, the fields should be empty again afterwards. And to empty the fields after inserting, we can simply say here after adding the row that we empty the variable iContactEntryRow, and therefore we enter here do iContactEntryRow.$clear. Let's quickly test this. Paul, Ford. Very good. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it and that we'll see each other again next time. Until then, take care.